Good afternoon, everyone who is in the Stanford area, and good morning to people here in Asia, and good day to people elsewhere. It's a pleasure to start our May the 2nd, 2023 session in our series on entrepreneurship and Asian high-tech industries. I'm Richard Dasher. I direct the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center at Stanford, which produces this series. And we want to thank our member companies because it's thanks to their support that we can put on these programs. Today, we have a panel of speakers on the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Korea and its outlook in kind of the global context. And I'm delighted to be able to turn over the program to a guest moderator today. Clara YoonJin spoke in our series about Korea last year. She is an advocate for technology startups across the globe. She is a co-founder and chief strategy officer of STAYGE Labs, which is a K-pop fan community platform that's generated Korea's leading global entertainment company. It's partnering with CJ E&M, which is Korea's global entertainment leading company. And she has been an advisor and an angel investor. She's founded other companies in the past. I first got to know Clara when she was the manager of really one of Korea's first and most successful business accelerators, K Startup. And out of K Startup, a couple of the entrepreneurs who've gone on to do great things are our panelists for today. Victor Ching is the co-founder and CEO of Miso. And Miso is a home services marketplace where customers can book over 70 different services, including things like cleaning or moving or repair or interior remodeling and so forth. They've raised over $11 million in funding, and they were actually a successful company in Y Combinator in 2016. Also with us is Tony Young-Suc Liu, and Tony has gone from being the entrepreneur side. He was co-founder and CEO of Corbit, which was Korea's first cryptocurrency exchange. And after working with Corbit, he has gone over to the investor side. He is a venture partner with Softbank Ventures Asia, which is the global early stage VC arm of SoftBank Group. He's also founded Tide Institute, a nonprofit organization that provides technology entrepreneurship education. And he's worked in Germany and in Austria as an associate expert at the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. He's also worked in Sri Lanka as a vocational school teacher for the Korea International Cooperation Agency. So we have very interesting people, and I'm going to turn over the microphone to Clara, kind of stay in the background, and I may have a couple of questions in the middle of this. What we would like to do for those of you who are joining by Zoom, if you have a question or a comment, please write it in the chat window. And then I'll relay the question to Clara, and Clara will dispose of it as appropriate with our panelists. Clara, the floor is yours. Thanks so much for coming today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Clara. I'm currently working on K-pop platform in Korea, but before I was in Silicon Valley last 7 years and co-founded a company called LifeSite, which is a digital data service. So I do have experience both in Silicon Valley and Korea. So today I wanted to kind of bring the perspective of what's like to actually work in Korea, or what's the difference between Korean market and the global market. And I did session before, so today I brought two very successful and then very thoughtful, and then who have a lot of perspective on the ecosystem of Korea. I brought these two entrepreneurs that I have worked with, and after I left Korea, they became very, very successful. So I want to ask some of the question how they, got to where they are right now, and some of the perspective of comparison between Korean market and then global market. So hi, Victor and Tony. So I think, Professor Dasher kind of briefly introduced you guys, but would you mind sharing who you are, what kind of company you have founded, and then why you founded a company so that people know, who you are. So can we start with Victor?
My name is Victor Ching. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Miso. Miso, we started it in 2016, and we're building a home services platform. We're trying to make booking a home service as easy as buying a product online in Korea. So our thesis is that, whenever you want to buy a product, you can turn to Amazon. If you're hungry, you can go to DoorDash. If you need to get somewhere, you can go to Uber. But if you need to move your home, if you want to get something repaired, if you need a plumber, there's still no go-to service. And that's what we're trying to build. Whenever you need any type of home services, just automatically open the Miso app and get it done. To date, we've done quite well. We've in 7 years, we've facilitated more than $500 million in transactions. Us being a two-sided platforms, we have customers and we have service provider partners, and we've connected over 700,000 customers with over 70,000 service provider partners and completed over 7 million bookings. For me personally, I grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii. I went to college at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I came to Korea to be a digital nomad for about a year or two. But I ended up staying for a while, and this is my 17th year in Korea. I guess the reason why I stayed in Korea for so long is that I found a lot of great opportunities here as a foreigner who also understood the Korean language and Korean culture. My biggest kind of break in Korea was when a company called Delivery Hero wanted to launch food delivery services in South Korea. I was the first person hired on the ground here as chief product officer, and we were able to grow the company to do over 10 million food delivery orders a month in Korea. Delivery Hero went public in Germany. So that was really an opportunity that I was able to get as a foreigner who was both fluent in English and Korean, understood Western best practices, but also understood the Korean market. And after, I wanted to do something on my own, so I started a company called Miso. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today, and hopefully I can share something interesting for you all.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. He has a very unique background, which is kind of hard to find in Korea. So that's why I actually asked him to be one of our speakers. So I'm very looking forward to hearing his story. And can you introduce yourself, Tony, as well?
So yeah, as Professor Dasher mentioned, right now I am a venture partner at a VC firm called Softbank Ventures Asia. Previously founded a cryptocurrency exchange called Corbit. As for my background, I grew up in Korea, Japan, and the US. Did most of my schooling in the US. I went to high school in New Jersey and college in New York. And then after spending my 20s mostly in international development, I went to Silicon Valley when I was about 28 years old. And then I started 2 companies in Korea after that. The first one was a crowdfunding company. It was similar to Kickstarter, which was popular in the US at that time. I didn't see a similar business in Korea, so I started a crowdfunding company. And the reason I did that was partly because I studied engineering for undergrad, and then financial economics for grad school. So I wanted to combine engineering and finance. So both of my companies were in the fintech space. The first company didn't do well. So after I shut it down, I spent a year learning how to program. And then my second company was Corbit, the Bitcoin exchange. So I expect everyone to kind of know what a Bitcoin exchange is, but I just included a screenshot just for illustrative purposes. And so just to give you an understanding of the scale and the status of the company, we are one of the 5 licensed cryptocurrency exchanges that can process Korean won in South Korea. The last full year that I was in a CEO, we had over $60 million in net profit. And then the next year, in that year, 2017, I sold the company to the owner of one of Korea's largest gaming companies called Nexon. Recently, the company received $75 million in funding from a large South Korean conglomerate. And just to give you a timeline and our fundraising, so we raised about $6 million in total before the acquisition. And I included a Bitcoin price chart because that kind of follows the revenue and profitability of our company. So it was a few years of zero revenue and very tough environment before the cryptocurrency boom in 2017. And currently, so for the last 2.5 years, I have been a venture partner at Softbank Ventures Asia. We invested about $500 million in 2021. We have offices in Seoul, Beijing, and Singapore. And we have about 300 portfolio companies. Okay, that's it for me.
Thank you so much. They do have a really interesting background, don't they? And it's very actually hard to bring those two, very successful entrepreneurs. So I'm going to ask you guys the first question. So, you both actually have a global experience. You could start companies anywhere in the world. But why did you come back to Korea or come to Korea and started a company here? What brought you here and what did you see that opportunities here? Tony?
Okay. When I decided to become an entrepreneur, it was in Silicon Valley because I was, influenced by all the great startups there. I wanted to do something in Silicon Valley, but first of all, I didn't have a visa. So because I'm a Korean citizen, I wasn't allowed to stay in the US. But another reason was, if I really had the desire and the passion and I had something great, then, I could have raised funding and then maybe I sponsor myself to be in the States. But the businesses I did were both translating or transplanting a successful business model in the US and then doing it in Korea. And so I guess opportunistically, it made sense for me to do something in Korea because it was a market that, where I can be a market leader pretty quickly. That's it.
And Victor?
Yeah, for me, the reason why I ended up staying in Korea so long is there were little pockets of opportunity that I could take advantage of as a foreigner. For example, when I first came, there were a lot of Korean companies looking to expand to the US market. And one of the things they wanted to understand was how can we advertise on Google? In Korea, Google is not the most popular search engine. It's a company called Naver. So Google was very foreign to a lot of Korean companies, and there were not many people who understood Google search engine that well locally. So that's an example of an area where I was able to kind of take advantage of my knowledge of the US market. Later on, that kind of expanded to the Korean market, where I think Korea has become a lot more data-driven recently, but in 2010, I think you heard a lot from the startup ecosystem that basically you execute whatever the CEO wants. It's a very hierarchical type of society. So things were not really being decided on upon data, more upon whatever the CEO wanted to do. But for me personally, just understanding these best practices of like using data, conversion rates, things like that, gave me an opportunity to get that job at Delivery Hero when they wanted to launch in Korea, because that German company was very data driven. So I think you get many pockets of opportunity that are uniquely available to people who understand both the Korean and US markets?
I mean, I started a company in Silicon Valley and then I decided to come back. I mean, it was COVID time. And for me personally, I saw Netflix was pouring money into Korean market and I knew that content market would blow up. So that's why I decided to hop on this K-pop market. And it did actually, it was a right actually judgment because now we have 15 million users. But the reason I'm talking about it is because I also think there's some, huge difference between running companies in Silicon Valley or in America versus Korea. Like, for example, my employees in the US, I didn't actually have any Korean employees. It was actually very diverse, Indians, like Chinese, everybody. But Koreans are very, like all my employees right now are all Korean. So there's got to be some difference between running the company, versus, in Korea versus global market. And then, so what do you think that the most, maybe the biggest difference between running company in the US and running in Korea, if you know actually about the, the difference, Victor, maybe you have that more experience because you were with the Y Combinator, so.
Yeah, well, I've never like run a company in the US, so I don't really know what it's like, but I do understand that Korea is very homogenous. So for example, probably 95%, we have about 150 employees and 95% of our employees are Korean. And then we have another 5% of our employees are foreigners who don't speak any Korean at all. So I think that's kind of unique here. But I don't really have any other insights as to the differences between running a company in the US versus Korea. There's other like, things like labor law would be different or things like that. But yeah.
But do you think that because of that kind of environment, Korean companies are getting global and global more, but still it's pretty, I think, local base. Do you think it interferes to go global? For example, your service, I think it can be useful and actually in the US as well. So do you think that it interferes, that the lack of diversity or something?
I would assume so. I would assume that, having such like the Korean market's not one of the largest in the world, but it's quite large and it's large enough where companies like Coupang or Kakao, they only focus on the Korean market, but they're able to build sizable companies. So, you have this situation where you could simply focus on the Korean market and create something quite sizable. And from there, what I hear a lot about Israel is that the local market's so small that you basically have to take it like global from day one. So I think, the viewpoint from the entrepreneur's perspective is that, like in Korea, you'd focus partially on the Korean market and try to take it global. And I would assume that it would make it a little more difficult. For us, we've had plans to expand outside of Korea for a few years, but it's tough because I think the first reason is we see a lot of opportunity in Korea. So if we invest an extra $1 million into our business, should we invest that money into starting in a new market or just growing more in Korea? And the decision up until now has always been to invest more money into the local market.
I have a now question that so when you're fundraising, when you apply for the Y Combinator, do they actually perceive you as a Korean founder or like foreign founder actually? Actually, I'm so sorry. Did YC oh, so there's a question.
Well, that's all right. We'll get to Isha's question in just a minute. Isha's one of the students in our class and delighted that we've got a question, but go ahead. You're on something interesting about, Y Combinator versus what the reality is in Korea.
Yeah, it's like I sometimes feel like it's good to present myself as actually a Korean founder, but when I go to Japan, so I'm actually expanding my business to Japanese market, and this is my second time actually getting into this market. And last time was I presented myself as a US company founder, and it was easier for me to get into that market. And I was just wondering, you have a different, like diverse background. When you apply for Y Combinator, was it easier versus than Korean founder actually
I would assume it'd be easier for me to get funded by YC just because I'm fluent in English. You have to go through the interview process, and I think you need to have at least basic understanding of English to get funded by YC. But when we got into YC, we were very curious as to whether they would kind of push us to launch in the US. But they understood from day one that we should simply focus on the Korean market. And I think if we had ideas of expanding to other countries back then, they would have dissuaded us from doing that. So YC understood that we are a Korean company focused on the Korean market and funded us knowing that. I think after YC, when we went through Demo Day, we had to meet other investors. And I think the difficulty there is Silicon Valley investors, they're looking for the best companies in the world. And I think there's enough good companies in the US where a lot of their perspective is, why do we have to invest in a company in Korea? Because there's enough good companies in the US. So it's very difficult to raise funding after YC. But YC understood we were a Korean company.
I see. That's good. Since we're talking about YC, and I think it ties to the investment, so I'm gonna ask question to Tony. So now you're working as a venture capitalist, and then what we talk about this whole scene right now about the start of the winter came, right? So. So as a venture capitalist, is it really bad this year? And then what's it like? What do you see investment flow in global market, and especially in Korea? And if you're investing, probably you're still investing. And if you're investing, what do you look at the most? It could be data, it could be team or anything. What do you look at the most? And what kind of startups would your fund actually invest?
Sure. So I guess like generally, last year there was less, venture capital investment in Korea and in the US than the year before. So last year, I think there was about a 12% decline in South Korea in terms of overall VC funding into startups. But that's actually less of a decline than in the US. I think the US was about like 30% decline. So in terms of sectors, the top sectors in Korea are, IT, retail, and services. And then the third is healthcare and bio. So Korea has a special program for healthcare and bio companies to be able to IPO with like a streamlined process without having to have years of profitability. So that was kind of like a loophole that enabled a lot of bio companies to IPO. But then that led to some side effects where the companies didn't perform as well after the IPO. So there's like a backlash now. So there's a huge decline in the whole market. One of the only industries that increased in funding last year was content industry. So, movies, performances, music. So that actually had like about a 10% increase. So I think, Clara, you're in a very good space right now.
Yes.
So yeah, even in SoftBank, I think we're looking more into, content investment, because it's one of the few industries that a Korean company can actually go global. And it's already been proven by, a few cases so far. So those are like some of the changes in the landscape these days.
Yeah, just to add comments on that, recently we've been, having some meetings with Japanese actually venture capitalists. We're not fundraising, but we're going to fundraise next year because this year is not the good year. But we asked them whether we had to position as a Japanese company, set up another entity, and then as a Japanese company, and then reach out to the market. Does it really necessary to a lot of investors or the people work in Japan? Actually, they told us, because we're doing K-pop, a lot of Japanese people really, really, really want the K-pop, news or information or whatever related to the K-pop. That K-pop is Korean pop, right? So we have to actually position ourselves as a Korean company. That's probably better, or it's not gonna affect us in any negative way if we position as Korean company in Japan market, which was actually quite interesting for me. So I'm glad that content side is increasing with the funding area. Yeah, but I still think it's not easy to sometimes run company in Korea. I mean, it's not easy generally, but because Korea is very still, I think, lack of diversity. So for Korean companies to go global, there's some struggle for that perspective. So I'm going to ask some questions about diversity in this Asian market. And do you find Korean companies now way better with diversity? It's like not just the ethnical way, but I'm talking about maybe gender equality, or like team consists of different age, and different school background. Does it, because it used to be not really diverse when I was even working here before, but I find it a lot of changing, but still, still there's some lack of it. But do you find a lot of companies or yourself as a founder, really working on that kind of equality or diversity? Both of you, yeah. Do you want Tony, you want to go first, or Victor?
Oh, Victor, you can go first.
Yeah, I mean, to be totally transparent, diversity, it's not really that much of an issue in Korea, in that companies are not really emphasizing it. That's kind of my take on it. Definitely in terms of ethnicity, basically in Korea, most of your employees, if not all, will be Korean. The second point is gender diversity. I didn't work in Korea 20 years ago. I just hear these stereotypes that, like, for example, women in the workplace, they had a different standing or were treated very differently. I think especially with startups are a lot more progressive, so that you don't really deal with those types of issues. That's my perspective as a male. In terms of our company, we have about a 60-40 male to female ratio, but it's not really a metric that we really keep track of in terms of hiring.
Oh, I see. Well, I find it a little bit differently, because when I was working as, in the more like a VC area, when I worked with you at the K startup, I didn't see a lot of female, actually, even venture capitalists. I was always the only female, maybe VC at the time, and not young female entrepreneurs, not many of them. I see it a lot now. So I thought Korea had some sort of more those type of movement going on, where people, intentionally pay attention to do that. I thought so. That's why. But what do you see, with your portfolio companies, with that kind of trend, Tony?
So yeah, for me, I think as Victor mentioned, diversity isn't like a front and center topic in Korean startups or in the VC. Partly because I guess it's a very homogenous country in general, so people aren't aware. So in the VC industry, I think there are more, I guess, female, partners and heads of VC companies these days than before. Before maybe like 5-10 years ago. So I think it's just naturally getting better without too much conflict.
Because the
Can I
US,
jump in? Can I jump in for a
Mhm.
second?
Mhm.
Because I think that this is a great time to pick Isha's question about the very beginning stages of your startups. Um, since you all have really unusual backgrounds, what was it like to put together the first team for your company? Tell a little bit about how you really put the first people together and got the company started off the ground, because they're looking at you and they may see different for each one of you, right? This is not somebody who has been with me since I was in elementary school kind of thing. Victor, why don't you go first, and then Clara, and then Tony?
Yeah, so whenever I started a company, they were people I either worked with or were friends with previously. So for example, if I look at my company prior to Miso, I started it with the first engineer we hired at Delivery Hero Korea. And then when we started Miso, we actually ended up joining with a different, like, other founders that we shared office space with for 6 months during that K Startup Accelerator program. So in general, I do think choosing good co-founders is very important. You want to know them either personally or professionally, hopefully both. And in my case, I've always had the opportunity to work with people that I knew previously. But as you mentioned, I didn't go to school here, so I don't have that college network or that high school network, which other entrepreneurs locally tend to have.
But it's interesting that you had the ability, you had the experience with the people, the prior experience, and that's the big lead in. Clara, how did you start with people both live side and also stage?
Yeah, for this company, I actually joined later. I mean, I joined the very beginning as a board member, but I actually rejoined it later. But my co-founder right now, he and I worked in the same building when we did the case startup. He was on the second floor. He was a venture capitalist. He was a very, very known venture capitalist. So he was investing in a lot of companies, and I just had that kind of, that whole Korean startup ecosystem actually connected us. But what's important to me to start a company is actually whether I share same value or the vision. I do believe the vision and mission of the company is very important, because entrepreneurship is so hard. Starting a company starting a company can be easy, but going through this rough times and then even good times together, and have a right, right argument to have a right direction to keep growing. You encounter a lot of arguments and differences between the co-founders, and it's not easy. And I find that when you have a same mission, when you have something to tie together, that's easier to solve those kind of conflict, and keep moving forward to the next growth. So that was what I shared with my co-founder, and then previous company, it was same way. I wanted to solve the mission that I believed. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. So Tony, as somebody who grew up outside Korea but had Korean passport, what was it like to try to put together a team?
So for Corbett, yeah, I didn't have like a school network, similar to Victor. So what I did was I created the site myself and launched it and started getting revenue. And then I looked for a co-founder, partly so that I'd be able to persuade people better to join the company, partly because I was more confident that I wouldn't be getting them into joining something that would fail. And so the first co-founder was someone I had created a nonprofit together with, prior to Corbett. So we had some experience there. And then the other co-founder was someone I just met at a talk like this. So I was giving, a lecture about entrepreneurship and startups. And then he was one of the participants there. It turned out he had a very good background that was a fit for our company. So I brought him on board.
All participants, please listen. This is one of the, sometimes it happens, things from our programs. Clara, do you mind if I keep the floor for a minute or two? Because there's some audience questions that are coming in that are good ones, I think.
Yeah, I think it's better to actually get some questions from them from now on. Yeah.
Yeah. So Tony, what do you think about Silicon Valley Bank?
So, I mean, my understanding was, and this is as a foreigner, reading the news in the US, that the Silicon Valley Bank situation was resolved, the government backstopping all the deposits. So I don't know what this particular problem is right now. Maybe if you're just talking about the banking sector in general, was it First Republic that was sold like yesterday?
Yeah.
So that would be more of a general macro banking issue. In Korea, we don't have that issue yet. But so I'll just, from a VC standpoint, I guess, and from a startup standpoint, I guess it's a matter of just, diversifying your deposits into multiple banks. So you're not exposed to one. Similar to what we did at Corbett, at one point we were managing over $1 billion in customer deposits. And, counterparty risk was always a big issue. And even though it costs a little more, it's in the long run, just being that careful, I guess, paid off.
Yeah, just for everybody, this is a topic. I'm here for a meeting of the Asia Development Bank. And so SVB kind of showed up in the content talked about yesterday. And the one line that really sticks with me is when the rate of inflation is higher than the rate of GDP growth, you tend to be moving toward instability in an economy. And, these banks have, the problem with Silicon Valley Bank was they were exposed because of overinvesting in US treasuries. That's an unbelievable kind of situation. But yeah, so we have kind of macroeconomic situation that's a real mess right now. And I think that there are certainly, implications for how both startup companies and venture capitalists are going to have to deal with that. We probably have to put that into another program. Had a couple of questions. One is going back to Isha's first question about, how you validated your ideas, but especially we got a question from Ching about, taking a business that you saw in the US, a business model that's working here. How do you know what to do with it in Korea? What kind of changes you have to make? What sort of early stage validation do you do for the Korean version? I'm going to keep in order. Victor, how about you first?
Sure. I think validation of the idea, whether it be in Korea or the US, would be very similar. But I do think you have to kind of look at the uniqueness of the Korean market. For example, half of the population of Korea lives in the metropolitan area of Seoul, whereas in the US, you have this huge landmass and you have so many cities that are very populous. So I think that's one factor. So when we first launched, we wanted to understand what service radius we would cover, because ours is like an online to offline type of company, and what you're going to cover in terms of that offline component is very important. But lucky for us, the metropolitan area of Seoul covers about half the population. And when it comes to the addressable market, it could be even more than that. Even though we've launched nationwide, 70% of our revenue comes from the metropolitan area of Seoul. So I think that's one unique point. I think another thing that we looked at was, how does this service get facilitated currently in Korea? So when we started as a cleaning service, we looked at the current method for Korean consumers to get cleaning. And basically cleaning would be facilitated by work referral agencies. So you have these agencies that if you're looking to work, you can find restaurant jobs, you can find cleaning jobs, you can find construction, part-time jobs, any type of part-time job, you go to these agencies. And the working conditions were very bad. Basically, you'd go at 5 or 6 a.m., go to the agency, sit in a waiting room. And then if you get a call for a job that day, then you get dispatched to the job site. And we thought, with an app, basically you can just sit at home, look at what jobs are there, and then choose the job that you want and not have to go to that work referral agency and spend hours there. Sometimes they'd go home empty-handed. So we saw how these services were facilitated, and we saw the problem points and tried to improve on those unique problem points that existed in Korea.
I can add something. I think you have to look into the law as well. Like, for example, Uber still cannot perform here, because they didn't know how powerful the union of taxi here. So they just thought, just like the Uber did with San Francisco, we just launched the service the customer wants, and then we can kind of convince people later. It doesn't really work here, So every culture has a different types of, different things that you have to keep in mind in terms of, I think, legal issues even. So I think that's one of the key points when you bring different business model to the different culture, But I remember when I was working at K-Startup, the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, they were joking about how Korea is the best testing. Actually, Seoul is the best testing city in the world because we have the highest internet. I'm so sorry. Highest internet speed country in the world, and also just like Victor said, everybody, more than half of the population, actually 2/3 of the population live in Seoul, this one city, tiny city. So once it works here, they think it works outside of the Korea. So that it was kind of like a joke they would talk about. So I think it's a good way to test your product, whether it works, people will be interested in it or not. And Korean people are very interested in new things, and they get bored easily as well. So I think it's a good way to start. Yeah, I mean, test your market here.
So Tony, it sounds like things did not always work out the way you hoped they would with the companies that you started. What have you learned along the way about this kind of idea of validation?
So the benefit of doing, copying a successful US model in Korea is, there's partial validation that some people will actually, want this type of service. It was proven in the US. The bad part is that other people know that as well. So there are other entrepreneurs that will quickly be able to do something very similar. So that was the case with my first startup. When I started the company, there were no competitors in the space. We were the only crowdfunding company. But it took about 6 months for me to launch that time. And by the time we launched, there were 5 other companies doing the same thing. So the competition can ramp up very quickly. Another thing would be understanding if the timing of the market. So is the US may be ready for something, but then is Korea ready for the same thing? So that was the case for me with Bitcoin. I wasn't sure, even if I launched this, did anyone in Korea know what Bitcoin was? And would they actually want to buy this? Because there was no news articles about Bitcoin at all in Korea. So that was my main concern with Corbit. So what I did was I spent like half a day creating a landing site for the exchange. So this was before I decided to launch the service. I wanted to see if, if I can test it out. And then I said, Bitcoin exchange is launching in Korea, please, sign up for early access and all that. And then I spent a day just seeing the reaction. And then, 5 people signed up, committed about $5,000 worth of demand. So that's when I decided to launch the company, when I decided to build the company, actually, based on, very simple, a survey.
Okay, thanks. So for all of you, that was a few years ago, and now is now. I mean, with all the post-COVID kind of difficulty in the economy and everything, how do you think the sort of just conditions for being an entrepreneur have changed in the last 6 or 7 years since you started your companies? If you were to start something tomorrow, what would you have to do different than what you had to do the first time around? Anyone want to take that to start with?
Well,
Otherwise, I will name names.
I think it should be actually Tony or Victor, because I start my last company in Silicon Valley, and I think it's too different than Korean.
Okay. Okay.
I do think startups are a lot more popular these days. So popular means there's a lot more funding opportunities anywhere from the angel to the growth rounds than there were 10 or even 5 years ago. And I think it's more popular in the perspective that many more people want to work at a startup. So when I was doing Delivery Hero or Yogio, it was very hard to hire engineers or designers because most people wanted to work at Samsung. So the pool you were trying to hire from was very small. There were not many people looking at startups. Now there's many more people that want to work at startups, but there's many more startups. So it's still difficult to hire because you're competing with many more companies to hire great talent. But I do think the fact that there's more people interested in startups, more funding opportunities, there's pros and cons to it, because I do believe personally that you develop a lot of great traction or insights, or you can build a great product from having constraints. And sometimes you see cases where companies, they overhired, they had too much money. And I do think we're starting to see these situations come to play sometimes in Korea, where it didn't really happen that much 5 or 10 years ago.
Okay. Tony?
I'll add to that there's also a lot of good, I guess, startups where people get trained in the startup culture and the processes. So when I was doing my startup, not only did I have to bring a business model, I also had to bring like Silicon Valley culture and mentality and the work processes as well, because the people who are hiring weren't really used to like a startup environment. But now we have great startups already where people spend maybe a few months just to learn what the best practices are, and then they would do their own startup, or they would join another one. And another difference I see is that there are a lot more B2B SaaS companies that we can utilize in Korea nowadays versus 10 years ago. So before, when we were doing Corbett, for like a hiring service or like a chatting application, we had to use American solutions because there were no local Korean solutions for that. But these days, there's SaaS services for pretty much most activities, so we can use Korean services, so we don't have to translate something, or it's more attuned to our workflow.
Okay, thanks. So Clara, I let you off the hook with that one, but there's a question from Sarah about the gender imbalance in the Korean entrepreneurship ecosystem. I think that's one that I'd definitely like to hear your comments on. Is what sort of imbalances are there? Not only men, women, but other kinds of imbalances. And do you see things moving forward?
I definitely think things already got a lot, moved forward. I see a lot of female entrepreneurs around any of those startup events, and I think it's the entry point for female entrepreneurs to even pitch or to to show what they want to build is it's abundant, it's everywhere. What I actually find a little bit still difficult is with corporate culture, because I work with corporates a lot, and it's still, I think there's some gender or sexism there, or the Korea is based on the Confucianism, so the age actually matters a lot. So it depends on the age. You have to use different forms of languages and stuff. That actually is important, and I think is still there in the corporate culture. But in startup cultures, I don't see it, especially these days. I think Korean startup got a lot actually. It got a lot similar to the format of actually Silicon Valley companies. Maybe it's only my company, but it's very similar. So for example, we don't use Korean names. None of our employees actually use their Korean names because we want flat culture. So like I use Clara. So anyone who is even maybe 15 years younger than me, she can call me Clara, instead of calling YoonJin direct, like YoonJin CSO.
Honorific name or whatever.
So everyone can talk to everybody, easily. So I do think it got a lot better. But as both of them said, I don't see any intentional movement a lot compared to California or the Silicon Valley that I was in. There were lots of female entrepreneurship or education or diversity and inclusion talk, and all the things were always, you kind of have to intentionally think about it and then put that as maybe in company policies or something. When I was in California, but not here. You don't really have to intentionally think and then input that thought into into running your company. So maybe that's a little bit different. Yeah.
Okay. Tony, Victor, you're both using non-Korean names. Is there a connection?
There is, so in our company as well, we used US nicknames instead of using our full Korean name, because in order to provide a more equal culture.
Yeah, when I before starting my own company, I worked at a regular company in Korea, and they would refer to people by their last name and their title. So if you're a manager or if you're like associate manager, so it'd be, like Ching Daddy or Ching Hwajang. And for me, it was very like uncomfortable. So definitely when I started my own company, I didn't want to use that system.
See, now this is one of the things about how culture plays a part in everything. I'm fascinated that you all have been part of a movement that when the culture decides that something is holding it back, it gets rid of it, it moves forward. This is kind of neat. Had a question, really this insider perspective. And we've kind of talked about this quite a bit already, but in regard to being seen as an insider in the Korean system, do you think that's a big factor in trying to be successful? How do you become an insider in the Korean system if you're coming in with an idea from the outside? Anybody can go first.
That's a bit tricky question, actually.
Yeah, it is. It's even trickier if you call it the emic perspective, but I think that, yeah.
I mean, I think everywhere you have to do networking, actually. And if you're a foreigner, I think Korea is nowadays, I think a lot better, but even 5 years ago, I found it more difficult to enter this Korean community because Korea got invaded so many times from Japan, China, Russia, historically. So people have tendency to not to really accept maybe the foreign, foreign people, or not really foreign culture, I don't think, but they do have some sort of like a blockage to really fully accept. But these days, actually, I find, I don't know, maybe my community is like that, but it's actually quite diverse. And I think once you're genuine, and if you're specialized in something that maybe Koreans cannot solve it, I think because we live in a society, it's kind of, we have to benefit each other. I think Korean people also want to learn, and now more open-minded about working together with non-Koreans. So if you approach people who are Korean and try to get into inside of the Korean, if you have that kind of attitude, I think it helps to get in, and then you have to keep actually going to these events, and then keep connecting with the people who have the similar values or interest, and or beneficial interest. So I guess that's
Yeah, okay. Quick question for Victor, and then I have kind of a variety of this question for Tony. Victor, how much was speaking Korean, being able to be fluent in Korean, a factor? Is that something that you think someone who wants to take an idea to Korea should learn how to do themselves, or can you just hire people who speak Korean? What do you do?
I do think it's very important to understand the language. We do have employees in the company that don't speak any Korean at all. We have a member on our executive team who doesn't speak any Korean at all, and everything's just a little more difficult. There's a little more friction. You need to have somebody be able to translate, explain situations for you. Whereas for me, I can understand them like directly. So I do think, in a market like Korea, understanding the language and the culture is quite important.
Okay. So Tony, as Silicon Valley has grown, and there's just so much venture capital here, the competition among VCs has gotten a lot worse. And so there's this view of the whole Silicon Valley venture capital community that you have the inside circle of really successful firms and then everybody else. Is that emerging in Korea? Are you seeing a lot of competition among Korean investors for access to the best deals? And do you have to be an insider in the VC world now?
Yes. So I think the VC industry is naturally a brand and signaling heavy industry. So, entrepreneurs want to receive funding from, good brand names because that helps them in hiring as well, and then sometimes in sales. So I think it's a natural process. There has been a lot of, many more VCs that are popping up in Korea. So, 2021-ish was probably the peak where all the VCs are competing for the good deals. So it's very similar to the US, I would think. As to be an insider, so yeah, there are, definitely benefits of, going to the same, college, the founder and the VC, for example, because it's easier to, I guess, reference check. But then, and also in Korea, there is a lot of respect for foreign trained people who studied in the US or overseas as well. So for me, that I was, seen as someone, kind of like a Korean American, and people respect that because, people see that, foreigners or people who are trained overseas have different perspective. Some they might have, been exposed to, models outside of Korea. So there's also that, duality involved.
Okay. Thanks. Kind of just clarification, is your fund part, or the SoftBank Ventures Asia Korea, going over to Taizoson, to this new fund that they're setting up from down in Singapore?
Yes, correct. Yeah, so recently we were sold from SoftBank Group to Taizo's son, which is the younger brother of the founder of SoftBank.
Okay. So when will that be finalized?
So my understanding is the contract is signed, but then there are some closing conditions and processes that have to be met. So probably I would expect by the end of the year.
Okay. So that's something for us to look forward to, and we may come back and ask you more after that's happened.
Mhm.
Clara, how are you doing? What kind of things are interesting to you at this point? Would you like to pursue any kind of topics further?
I mean, there are some questions that I've been reading by the chat, and then there's a question, last question is like, if there is anything that Korean market is ready for right now that is not yet the case for the US. I was just thinking about that. What you know, to Victor or Tony, is there anything that we're ready for but not in the US?
So I can interpret that as maybe some industries where actually Korea is more on the leading edge than in the
Yeah.
US. One thing that comes to mind is webtoons. So I think there are two Korean companies, Naver and Kakao. It's like the Google and the Facebook of Korea, and they, Korea has a like a population that really enjoys reading web novels and webtoons, and so they have been going to Japan. These companies, Japan, the U.S., and Europe, and actually doing very well. So it's one of the rare cases of Korean IT companies creating platforms overseas and succeeding. For example, like Kakao, they bought one of the leading web novel platforms in the US called Tapas, and then that's a webtoon company, and then another one called Radish. So they were both founded by Korean Americans as well, which is interesting. So these were US companies doing very well in the US, founded by Korean Americans, because Korea is actually more on the leading edge in that. And the reason why these companies are investing so much globally is because webtoons are, like the experimental factory for story intellectual property. And as you can see from Marvel, once you have a very good intellectual property in stories, that leads to movies, that leads to music, to gaming as well. So it's like the starting point for the content industry. And so it's cool to see Korea actually, being on the leading edge of that.
Thank you. Well, like even my company, like but it's kind of like different. Actually, my company is Korean company, but 80% of our users are global users. And as I told you, it's 15 million people and 80% are not Korean. So I don't know. I don't have the same, I can't really think about what's Korean will be good market for, but what I can tell is either Korean content is getting really powerful for sure, even if you start in the US or even if you start in the Korea, like it goes global, for sure. So I think that's kind of interesting perspective of Korean market. So
Victor, on your side, do you see some areas in which Korea is ahead?
Not really. I'm totally focused on our sector right now, so I don't really look at other sectors. But I do think, the unique point of Korea is the fact that the landmass is so small. You can travel to any part of the country in about 4 or 5 hours. If you take the metro area of Seoul, you have half the population right there. So I think that's a unique point where if you're looking at the Korean market, if you can take advantage of that, it's a lot easier to do something here than in the US.
So especially in your sector, Victor, older people may not be as comfortable just doing things online. At least that's kind of the way I would look at the US market, is that some of the people who really need your service, whether it's a handyman or somebody to come in and do cleaning or that sort of thing, how do you deal with that kind of digital divide?
Yes. So at first when we launched, we could just target people in their 20s, 30s, 40s and have a sizable market. And that's still the case today. But as we start to grow, we start to think of kids who want to provide services for their parents and how do we kind of facilitate that. But on the flip side, a lot of our service providers, for example, a lot of the people who work with us in the cleaning sector, they are women in their 50s on average. And it was very difficult to get them to understand how to use our partner app. Many of our partners didn't have a Google Play account. So early on in 2016, 2017, we'd make Google accounts for them and then log them in. And then if they got a new phone, they'd contact us saying that they can't download the app again.
Help.
Yeah. So that was very difficult. But in the last 5 years, things have changed quite a bit. And now everybody, pretty much no matter what their age, understands how to download apps and use smartphone basic functions.
Okay, so I think I'm going to use executive privilege and sort of move toward our last round of questions. And that is, where is this going? I think I'm going to ask a dangerous question to start with in this set. And that is, do you think Korea is underestimated outside Korea? Because it's an incredibly vibrant and, exciting place. And I was really reminded of that when I showed up the day before yesterday. Do you think that Korea is starting to generate the kind of excitement that it should? Clara, why don't you go first?
I don't think so at all, because even when I was talking to Japanese investors, they were all agreed that Korean markets are way bigger than Japanese startup actually market. Especially,
which is interesting considering that the GDP of the country is about half that of Japan.
Yeah, and then Japan always been known as a high tech, country, because they have Sony, all those Nintendo, everything, right? Fujitsu. But somehow they told me last week that Korean market is way bigger, and I was really surprised. And I do believe because of K-pop and all the K culture kind of also helped people to, know about Korean market and more. They're more familiar with Korean culture these days. Like beauty industry got really big, and also because of Coupang type of company, which went public in the US, now we have cases of companies who go global and then went public in the US and then have valuation way over than billions of dollars. I'm so sorry about my dog.
Charlotte's fine. Nobody, she's not bombing the set at all.
So, yeah, so I think when I came back, I was so surprised how much now the whole ecosystem grew, even how it operates actually got a lot more sophisticated. It's like document system and everything got much more easy for startups to be scalable than before when I was in Korea. So I do think Korean market has more to grow, but it actually grew a lot. Yeah. And I can toss to Tony.
So is Korea underestimated on the global stage? I guess not anymore as compared to a few years ago. I think it's a golden age for Korean, especially culture and content. So yeah, I think now the world is paying attention to Korea.
Okay, Victor.
Yeah, I basically agree with what Tony and Clara said.
So is there one thing in the system from now that really needs to happen in the next 5 years? What would you really like to see that would make things even better? And we'll make this the last question for today.
In the Korean ecosystem?
Yeah, in the Korean ecosystem, either on the startup side or the investment side or the kind of support services side or market access, anything.
For me personally, I do think, Korea, in terms of regulations, I think it's kind of a very difficult area. As Clara mentioned earlier, Uber tried to come into Korea, and basically we're not able to operate their services here. Even our sector, when we started like a cleaning service, we're governed by a law that was first created decades ago. So our office is mandated to have like a reception area for consulting prospective like service provider partners, and only people with certain licenses can kind of like work in that consultation area. But we try to explain to the government, hey, like people are signing up on the app, we're vetting them on, like digitally. Why do we need to have this space in our office? And the answer is, well, that's the law. So a lot of things outdated. Korea tends to have this policy of it's illegal until we explicitly say it's legal. So that's one issue from my perspective.
Okay, Tony, why don't you go next?
From looking from the VC and tech perspective, I would think it would be good if Korea can have a better playbook of Korean tech platform companies and tech companies in general being able to succeed globally. Right now, I think it's more haphazard. Like, for example, like, Naver, the Korean search engine, was successful in creating Line, which is a messaging app that became popular in Japan and Thailand. But those were like isolated cases. Korea looks to Israel a lot for inspiration and admiration, because we see that Israeli companies, a lot of them succeed in the US. They list on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. So not many cases for Korea. So if there was more of a reproducible playbook for Korean companies to be global, I think that would be very helpful.
Okay, Clara, you have the last word, and then I'll wrap up the session.
For me, I think I'm a huge advocate for diversity. So I do think if Korea can have more diversity, especially in terms of not just the gender, but ethnical background, I do think we have more potential to go global, because if you know about, let's say, Vietnamese market, you should hire Vietnamese people to understand the culture, what do they use the most, what kind of design they like. It is every culture has a different style, and you have to understand to reach out to those customers. And right now we only have a lot of them are usually just Koreans, and we will seek out some help, occasionally. But I think if we have diverse team, I think it will be easier for us to go global. And for example, like when I look at Coupons, actually, Coupon actually brings a lot of people from from the US who have done maybe Amazon, who have worked in Amazon. It's actually the whole leadership groups are pretty diverse, and they speak English, and they actually prepare translator if they need it, So I do think if we have more of that kind of culture in many more companies in Korea, I think we can have more opportunities to grab different market opportunities, not just the US, So that's what
Okay, thank you. And so I want to start by saying apologies to the last couple of question askers that we couldn't get to, but this is a good point to stop the program for today. I think we've got a really good picture of the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Korea, thanks to three great presenters and panelists. Thanks, Clara, thanks, Tony, thanks, Victor. This was great fun. Thank you so much today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.
Yeah.